Today's video is a little bit different from most of the videos you'll see from us. At face value, this has absolutely nothing to do with a homestead. This is an aquarium. It's about a 30-gallon aquarium, give or take. And it has basically 2 fish occupants. A colony of guppies and a few bushy-nosed plecostomus. So why am I filming this? In essence, if you think in biological or ecological terms, an aquarium is an excellent example of a contained ecosystem. Not necessarily self-contained, but contained, i.e., this aquarium has a fixed volume and its occupants, without human intervention, can't spread beyond the borders of the aquarium. They're essentially stuck in here. It sounds a little bit sad, I suppose, at first, but at the same time, you'll probably notice an awful lot of guppy fry. Essentially, these guppies are doing what guppies do, and they're producing lots of young. And part of the reason they're producing lots of young is because they're actually relatively happy, given their biological requirements, if you will, for water quality and mineral content and food, etc. I'm going to start with food, because I think this is one of the pieces of this aquarium example that does equate into most of our homesteads. What I mean by that is this is not a self-contained system. It requires external inputs. And essentially the first one is food. I have to feed these guppies. They will eat a little bit of the algae growth, but that's not enough to sustain them. And it's certainly not enough to sustain them at this population level. So I'm going to go ahead and just do that here quickly. And we'll see some happy guppies here probably momentarily. The thought here, for the vast majority of us, is that when we create our homesteads, when we come up with our homestead visions, a lot of us would love to be sustainable. Self-sufficient even is probably the ultimate goal. Not for everybody, but for some people. And that's a really hard goal, because the more biomass you have, the more biomass and space it takes to keep that biomass. So these guppies, as an example, this 30-gallon aquarium is not enough to feed a population at this size. But the guppies keep reproducing, because when they're happy, they just keep having babies, which is not unlike a lot of our livestock. This system also has some other features which are very similar. In the case of a lot of our homesteads, we have a certain amount of land. We all have a certain amount of land that we have to play with, basically. And some of us have more land than others. Some of us have less land than others. And that's really kind of a big limiting factor. Now, on our homesteads, our land may be affected by other influences that are sort of beyond their borders, i.e. weather, climate, latitude, elevation, right? All of these things sort of affect it. It's not just space. So this aquarium is a little simpler in that everything that's required to keep it in balance is essentially contained within that aquarium. We have a heater, which keeps the temperature optimal. We obviously have water, but the water essentially requires filtration. So we do have 2 sponge filters that you can see running. They run off of an external air pump, basically. And we also have a light. It provides wavelengths that the plants can utilize to then grow. And of course the plants do use some of the waste products through the various cycles, which I won't go into here, that the fish produce. But the bacteria that live in the sponge filters are also using that waste. So you have a very dynamic, although simple in some ways, and very small system here, where you have a lot of biological activity in a very small space. But each one of those organisms has some dependency on each other. However, they are also all kind of artificially supported by us, the humans. Again, a lot of similarities here to a homestead. I guess the biggest piece here is that when we raise plants and animals, when we are trying to maximize productivity, basically to feed ourselves, you need to keep those plants and animals relatively happy, because and I say happy in a relative term. You have to give them what they need to be successful. But you still require the inputs. You still require the maintenance, i.e. things like water changes. You know, this is not a self-sustaining It's contained, but it's not self-sustaining as far as the system goes. When you look at this system that has very few players and occupies a very small space, I really can't imagine this system functioning with any kind of productivity, i.e. could you keep one or two guppies potentially alive in this space with enough plant biomass? Possibly, provided that your outside temperatures and stuff maintain the water quality. You hypothetically could, but you would probably get little to no productivity out of them because you just wouldn't have the resources to support them. But when you artificially support them, it's like you can see here, the increase in biomass can be astronomical, but all of that comes with an energy input. This system requires inputs of energy, i.e. the air pump, i.e. the light, i.e. the heater. All very simple, not particularly energy draining, but it's still an energy input nonetheless. And that's another thing to think about in a homestead. The larger it is, the more complex it is, the more energy input you have. Now they could be feed, they could be infrastructure, because infrastructure obviously takes energy. I mean, this little system, somebody had to build the aquarium, so there's materials and energy has gone into that. You also have equipment, right? Depending on what you're raising, you could have things like greenhouses or hoop houses or grow rooms or heated greenhouses or machinery like tractors, etc., or climate controlled buildings. Like the list can go on and on and on, and it can get quite energy consumptive. And I think this is just something to think about in that term of self-sufficient or self-sustainable. There's always this line, and it's going to be different for everybody, but a true self-sufficient, self-sustaining environment or homestead really has no inputs. But the reality of it is there's very, very few environments on the planet that have zero inputs, because there's often inputs from elsewhere. Could be precipitation, could be runoff from another area, could be wind, right, that brings nutrients with it, could be ocean currents, could be any number of things. So it's not unrealistic to think that almost every homestead in existence is going to have outside inputs. I guess the closing piece here is the larger and the more complicated the system, and the greater the inputs required to maintain that system, the harder and harder it becomes to be self-sufficient, to be self-sustaining, to be sustainable, essentially. It's not impossible, but it becomes more difficult. And this kind of goes back to needs. I mean, this aquarium is an excellent example of, do we actually need these fish? No, we have them for enjoyment. Do we really get any benefit out of them? Well, outside of enjoyment, not really. We're not using them for food source. I suppose we could use some of them for compost or that sort of stuff. There is some nutrient cycling that could be used there. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to go to waste. The less necessary something is, the harder it can be to justify. A little aquarium like this, it's not exactly breaking the bank. It's a luxury item that doesn't kill you. But when you start getting into a homestead scale of things, that's where you start looking at pieces of the puzzle and trying to find those symbiotic relationships, those ways to reduce inputs, those ways to make things a bit more self-sustaining, i.e., maybe it's plants that are very easy to propagate with little separation distances so that it's just a simple thing, i.e. tomatoes, or animals that are basically really good or really easy at reproducing themselves, because if meat is your goal, that's a desirable trait. Some of these things don't necessarily equate directly into commercial scale or even trying to make much of an income on them, i.e. these guppies, we're not really doing this in a manner that maximizes guppy production. Now, that's not really something that we need, but there are ways to do this more efficiently with greater inputs and basically maximize the number of offspring that have been produced. We don't do that because we don't need to maximize guppy production, and there is a certain level of natural selection that goes on, i.e. they eat some of the young. Essentially ones that are born with maybe genetic defects or what have you don't last long, as opposed to a more intensive system where you kind of intervene and try to save sort of every single one. I mean, that could even equate to using incubators, right? A broody hen, for example, won't produce you as many chicks in a year, but you likely will have less issues with chicks that just are poor doers, i.e. the broody hens are usually pretty good at weeding them out. Hopefully this is another food for thought. It's a little bit of a ramble. It's a little bit of an abstract because it's not directly related to homesteading per se, but it does show things that we may take for granted or not think about. Anyways, if nothing else, hopefully you enjoyed watching these fish swim around their tank. If you think about it, it's a good example which kind of ties into my recent farm ponderings about sort of finding those symbiosis, but also looking at your homestead less as this unit separate from nature and more of a human constructed ecosystem, because essentially the purpose of that ecosystem is to supply us, the homesteader, with food. So on that note, I'm going to leave it there, and yeah, we will chat later.